Welcome to this edition of Cranmer Studies at 7:32 p.m., July 16, 2022, Saturday night. We're looking at Alan Weatherall's book, Cranmer, Theologian, Archbishop, and Martyr. We turn now to the times of Henry VIII. The emperor had great influence over the Pope, particularly since the sacking of Rome 5 years earlier in 1527. In the aftermath of this horrendous event, Clement VII, for a while, actually had been a prisoner of the emperor. The issue of annulling the marriage between Henry and Catherine was on the face of it quite straightforward. Verses in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, forbade a man to marry his brother's widow. And if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an uncleanness. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, and they shall be childless. Before her marriage to Henry, Catherine of Aragon had for a few months been married to an elder brother, Prince Arthur. Arthur had died of the sweating sickness, a contagious fever that regularly swept through England. When Henry became king on the death of his father, the political benefits of a union between England and Spain were still strong. Pope Julius II had used his authority to overrule the verses in Leviticus. Henry and Catherine were able to marry. There were precedents for this judgment of Pope Julius II. Over the centuries, there had been other deaths of husbands where a younger brother was available, and there were important reasons for powerful families to be united. On a personal level, the marriage between Henry and Catherine had been appropriate. Catherine had barely known her first husband. She had arrived in England only just before the wedding and had later declared under oath that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Henry had been only 10 years old when his elder brother died. But now Henry and Catherine desperately needed another son. Their only son, the Duke of Cornwall, had lived less than 2 months. Henry began to blame the lack of a male heir on the fact that his marriage to Catherine had flouted the Bible. If Pope Clement II would simply reverse his predecessor's decision, then Henry's marriage to Catherine would be annulled, would never have existed. Catherine would have been Henry's mistress for 23 years, not his wife. Their child, Mary, would be illegitimate. Henry would be free to marry and could have a son. As was widely known throughout the courts of Europe, Henry intended to marry Lady Anne Boleyn, daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, Earl of Wiltshire. But the simple plan was not working. In spite of 5 years of pressure from King Henry VIII, Pope Clement VII declined to oblige. Reversing his predecessor's decision would have made him look weak, and a pope who had fled from Rome, leaving it in flames, could not afford to look any weaker than he was. And in spite of the efforts of Cranmer and his predecessors, the emperor was no help in persuading the pope. Catherine of Aragon was his aunt, and he did not intend to see her publicly humiliated. Earlier, Henry had sent representatives, of whom Cranmer had been one, to Italy, France, Germany, and Spain to secure opinions in support of his case. In spite of extensive bribes, this approach also failed to influence the Pope. So Henry began to question whether the Pope had any authority in England. This was a much more complex issue than whether certain types of marriages were allowed. Many sources could be invoked to determine the extent of the Pope's powers. including the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, decisions by ecumenical councils in the 300 years or so after Christ, writings by the early patristic leaders, and records of the history of England. In addition, the new Lutheran Church, built upon a rejection of the power of the Pope, was developing arguments that might affect the case, which was why it was Cranmer's duty to sit at his ornate desk, overlooking a quiet piazza, and analyze the letters from his correspondent across Europe. Cranmer's work was interrupted by a loud knocking at a door below, and the sound of the outside door being opened, excited conversation, hasty footsteps up the stairs, and a knock at Cranmer's door. He'd already put his quill down and was ready to call out, "Entrata." His Italian servant came in, bowed, and apparently under some protest, showed in another servant who looked tired and unkempt from a long journey. The unknown servant bowed to Cranmer in his turn. "Your Reverence, my master, Sir Nicholas Hawkins, has just arrived from London and sends you his greetings. I have 2 letters here that I am bidden to deliver into your hands personally." With the emphasis on the last word, Sir Nicholas' servant looked scathingly at Cranmer's servant, who had evidently wanted that the letters be entrusted to him. "And my master asks if it would be convenient for him to call on you tomorrow morning." It was one of the duties of the ambassador to welcome visitors from England, and clearly Sir Nicholas's visit was important. "Tomorrow morning would be perfectly convenient," said Cranmer, "and please give my greetings to Sir Nicholas. Look forward to seeing him again." Cranmer sent his servant to escort Sir Nicholas's servant back to the hostel where he was staying. As dusk fell, the narrow winding streets were not always safe for people who might show by their hesitancy that they were strangers. Cranmer wondered whether to instruct his servant to say nothing about the letters from England, but it was decided it would be a waste of time. Such an order might even be given the letters more importance and cause the news of their arrival to spread more quickly. We'll resume that in our next segment. We turn now to the crisis of 1543, looking with Jasper Ridley, a notable biographer. The storm broke out in 1543. The council, after beginning with some Portuguese Jews, began a new wave of persecution of heretics. And on the 16th of March, Haynes, the Dean of Exeter, was questioned before the council about his evil opinions. Cranmer, who always had a personal dislike for this eminent Cambridge reformer, presided at this meeting, and he and his colleagues sent Haynes to the Fleet. On the same day, Cranmer was imprisoning Haynes as a heretic. Searles and Willoughby were riding to London with articles in their pocket accusing Cranmer of heresy. During the next few days, the council dealt with other heretics, including several members of the king's household, Philip Hoby, Weldon, and the musicians Sternhold and Marbeck, who were accused by Dr. London of heresy against the sacrament of the altar. They were all sent to the Fleet or Marshalsea. On Palm Sunday, 18 March, Dr. London was visited by Searles and Willoughby, and a further step was taken in the plot against Cranmer. The plot was inspired by Bishop Gardiner, who was meeting Cranmer almost daily in the council and in the Committee of Convocation, where they were working, along with Thurlby and Heath, on the final draft of the King's Book. On the 8th of April, they both attended a meeting of the council and committed 8 primers printers to prison, including two of Cranmer's old associates, Whitchurch, who later married Cranmer's widow, and Grafton, on charges of printing illegal books. They also ordered the Lord Mayor to search every house in London in order to discover who had been eating meat in Lent. And so the story goes. We turn to Paul Aris's Thomas Cranmer, scholar and churchman, with an article by Eamon Duffy on Cranmer and popular religion. He's been discussing religious processions as a community event. In the early 1460s, a dispute arose between church and wardens of a small town church in St. Ewan, Bristol, and the well-to-do merchant John Sharp over the arrears of rent for a corn shop which Sharp leased from the church. The dispute was bitter and involved the parish in expensive and prolonged litigation. It finally resolved in January 1464, when Sharp and the parish came to a settlement. He solemnized this agreement by declaring that he was averse of his conscience to depart of some of his goods and leave to this church, in order to have his own name and those of his wife and parents and deceased son entered in the general mind yearly, and so after their death prayed forevermore in communion bedroll. This is plain enough. It was clearly felt that the best sign of restored charity was enrollment in the commune bedroll, a dimension of the cult of the dead which I simply note here, but to which we will need to return in due course, since it bears on our present concerns. However, more was to follow. On January 8th, it was the turn of Sharp's wife to provide the holy loaf, the bread which was solemnly blessed each Sunday and distributed to parishioners after the main Mass as a symbol of charity. The offering of this loaf, which was regulated by Rota, was attended with considerable solemnity, the provider processing to the high altar before matins, reciting a special prayer and offering a candle to the priest at the same time. It was common in many places for the curate to pray explicitly, for the good man or woman that this day giveth bread to make the holy loaf, which he bid in the beads before reading the bead rolls at the Mass which followed. Elizabeth Sharp, clearly a woman with a sense of style, duly turned up at matins and full womanly brought the cake with candles into this church, her maiden bearing the same after hour, and a fire, twill towel with weekes at both ends and hool. Having duly offered the holy cake and candles, Mistress Sharp summoned the parson, the leading parish notables, and other divers, both men and women, who were assembling for matins. Declaring her great joy at the happy resolution of the dispute between her husband and the parish, she announced her intention of symbolizing the restoration of their mutual charity by bestowing her long embroidered towel after my decease for use at Easter as a housling cloth, to be held under the parishioner's chin to prevent fragments of the Blessed Sacrament falling to the ground. Till her death, she intended to keep the towel, which would therefore be fetched from her house by the parish clerk every Easter day, or in worship of the sacrament. On her decease, it would pass to the church without condition. Put that aside and shift to Leslie Williams' chapter on danger, chapter 11, 39 and 40. Cranmer wanted to link England with the German reformers, and no doubt had dreaded the thought of angry Germans foiled for the third time in an attempt at an alliance, not to mention the slashing insult of a rebuke after Anne's lavish state reception in England. However, Cranmer knew the king. Suspecting that Catherine Howard had already caught the king's eye, Cranmer argued with Cromwell about the Cleves affair. Cranmer thought it most expedient the king to marry where that he had his fancy and love, for that would be the most comfort for his grace. Politics 1. Cranmer, representing the Reformers, and Bishop Tunstall, representing the Conservatives, examined the situation and declared that legally nothing prevented the union. On January 6, 1540, Cranmer married Henry and Anne. It goes downhill from here. Henry's heart did not grow fonder with time. 6 months later, Anne repulsed him even more. Further, the political situation on the continent indicated an incipient breach between Charles V and France, so Henry felt safe enough to attempt to get out of the marriage. Convocation tried the case so that Cranmer was not required to act alone in undoing the previous declaration. Gardiner, not Cranmer, addressed Convocation, explaining the cause of the nullity of the marriage in a lucid speech. Cranmer found himself once again in the unenviable position of cleaning up after the elephant in this parade of wives. 6 years earlier, Henry had nullified Henry's marriage to Catherine, allowing him to marry Anne Boleyn. 3 years after that, he encountered his own decree and nullified Henry's marriage to Anne, allowing him to marry Jane. Now again, he had to reverse his own decision and declare Henry's fourth marriage null. For God's will to coincide with Henry's, the religious establishment had to stretch further and further for interpretations of whatever law remained, canon or otherwise. Convocation judged the marriage void on 3 grounds, all fabricated or exaggerated. Anne's pre-contract with Francis of Lorraine, which earlier had been deemed legal. The fact that the king had been forced into the marriage. Nobody forced Henry to do anything he didn't want to. And lack of consummation in her naivete. Anne thought that Henry's perfunctory goodnight kisses meant consummation of marriage, although others familiar with Henry could not possibly believe he had not consummated the marriage in all his time alone with her. 1540, the fiasco with that poor Anne of Cleves. He died in 1557. He was ultimately interred with a requiem mass and interred at Westminster Abbey. We turn now to Cranmer and the Reformation in England with Arthur Innes, who was discussing the Jesuits, and then he turned to Calvin. Speaking of Calvin, a native of Picardy who was driven out of France by the persecution which Francis carried out in his own dominions while he was intriguing with the Protestant princes. At the age of 27, he issued the work which shaped, with a remorseless logic, the conclusions implicit in the leading doctrines of the Swiss reformers. Not one less precise and rigid in its dogmatism than was the Roman Catholic religion after it emerged from the Council of Trent. Far more hostile to Catholicism than was Luther or even Zwingli, conceiving of the world as having been created by the Almighty in order to the salvation of the few elect and the damnation of the vast majority of his creatures. Quite the overstatement here, Art. demanding for the ministry of the right and the duty to punish with the sternest penalties, not merely offenses against social order, but defections from moral and disciplinary standard laid down. What about Henrician England, Marian England? An act of uniformity in 1559 and so forth. Use this or else. You want to talk about that, Artie boy? Because claimed assured salvation for the elect, but neither asking nor granting money for the reprobate. The stark and grim religion of Calvin laid its hand upon the Protestant Reformation. The Huguenots of France, the Netherlanders, the Scots, the English chiefly of the eastern counties, who later gave to America her pilgrim fathers, fell under its dominion. These two have their glorious muster roll of heroes and martyrs, the merciless rigor of their theory failing to crush entirely a certain illogical human tenderness of heart which redeemed Puritanism in its own despite. Calvin at first proved too harsh even for the Switzers, and he was banished from Geneva. But his personality was far too vigorous for repression. 3 years later, in 1541, he was recalled and established as a kind of religious dictator in a nominal commonwealth. Talk about a bigot who doesn't know Calvin's history. We turn to Prof. Mack, talking about rigged election or rigged nullity gigs. Picking up on page 274. Within 4 days, it was all over. Depositions, discussion, voting. By 9 July, 158 members of the Synod had put their names in person or by proxy to the beautifully written parchment instrument declaring that Anne of Cleves' marriage had never existed, thanks to her pre-contract with the Duke of Lorraine, together with Henry's inadequate consent and non-consummation once she had arrived in England. The reasons for the annulment indeed fell one over another in protesting too much. Bishop Clerk, who had the unenviable task of traveling to tell the Duke of Cleves what had happened, initially felt that these two causes, pre-contract and no carnal knowledge, would weaken one another. Dr. Kelly's modern dissection of the case pitilessly reveals the inconsistencies both with the marriage law then current and with what Cranmer had done in previous royal cases. Think Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and then Jane, who died, and now it's being done for the third time with Anne of Cleves. Nevertheless, there was little left to do except to see the formalities of the annulment through Parliament and prepare for the new royal wedding. This took place quietly on July 28, the same day that Thomas Cromwell was executed, and by 8 August, Catherine was being openly paraded at Hampton Court as a queen, another fast rig job. After her initial shock at the news of her imminent divorce, Anne had shown the sense to be sweetness itself after her curious situation, and she settled down to a comfortable and blameless existence on English estates lavished on her by her grateful ex-husband. No one has ever suggested that she made the wrong decision. One useful little byproduct of Henry's ebullient mood, perhaps also the product of Catherine Howard's assurances to Cranmer, was a measure introduced to the Lords on the same day that the nullity decree completed its passage through the two houses. It ended the 6 Articles threat of death penalty for priests caught in sexual incontinence. The Archbishop absented himself from the Lord's discussion in this proposal. Later, he attributed this modification of the 6 Articles legislation specifically to royal initiative, recalling that only a year after their first passage, Henry was fain to temper the said laws. Similarly, a savage would-be pogrom against London evangelicals, which the conservative hierarchy had unleashed in their hour of triumph in July, the first test of the effectiveness of the 6 Articles, was halted for good on 1 August by royal command. Henry was in a holiday mood, which was just as well for the 500 Londoners who'd been rounded up in the course of a fortnight. Others were not so lucky. Cromwell's death on 28 July was followed 2 days later by a famously paired set of executions, the gruesome Henrician equivalent of the grand finale firework display, to cap a half a year of political mayhem. While 3 papalist Catholics died for treason, 3 clergy widely admired in evangelicals, including Henry's former ambassador to the Lutherans, Robert Barnes, were burnt for heresy. Barnes, with admirable spirit, did his formidable best to embarrass Henry in a speech before he died. His death was widely seen as a symbol of Bishop Gardiner's triumph, but the event was symbolic in a greater sense of the to and fro character of politics from 1540 to 1547. There was a curious ecumenism to Henry's Church of England in these years. It was probably more inclusive of English religious opinion than any phase of the established church since. But the ecumenism also included murderous lunges against representatives of either religious wing. The conservatives were always trying to repeat the tactic which had worked to destroy Cromwell, to gather together evidence against an evangelical in order to suggest a combination of religious radicalism and subversive intent, and then, if possible, to extend the accusations onwards in order to suggest a wider conspiracy against the king's religious settlement. Equally, evangelicals listened out for any hint of conservative intrigue to return England to the papal obedience or to threaten the dynasty. For either wing, success was measured by convincing the king of the truth of their charges and by how high up the social and political scale the church charges could reach. These 7 years were characterized by contradictory swings of influence around the monarch, in which, up to mid-1543, Cranmer himself was in the enemy's sights. We turn now to Margot Johnson's Thomas Cranmer and her article on music and English liturgy. A delightful repast. Continental Reformed preaching, and especially that of Martin Luther, was much discussed in Cambridge in the early 1520s, in a group which included a number of future bishops and possibly Cranmer himself. When he visited Germany in 1532, he attended Reformed services and afterwards kept himself informed on Lutheran ideas and experiments, as well as of the Catholic tradition. The comparison of the views of Zwingli, Calvin, and Lutheran church music reveals the concern about its effects on comprehension, participation, and devotion. Zwingli, the most musically gifted of the 3, was the most radical, considering music to be a distraction in Christian worship and congregational hymn singing unscriptural. By 1525, all music, as well as ceremonial, was removed from the Zurich churches, and in 1527, the organ in Grossmünster was dismantled. In contrast, Zwingli recognized the value of religious music played or sung in private. Calvin shared many of Zwingli's views, but believed that music had a proper place in worship within certain limitations. He allowed the unaccompanied singing of metrical psalms in unison by the whole congregation, but polyphonic music was forbidden on grounds that the words could not be heard distinctly, and the congregation had to remain passive during its performance. Martin Luther's approach was different. He wanted all the arts, and especially church music, to be used in the service of God and therefore in worship. Later Lutherans, following his lead, developed a distinctive instrumental and choral tradition in the church. A little later, English Thomas Beacon expressed the Jewels of Joy, 1553, views similar to those of Zwingli, while approving of sacred music in private. He too was concerned about church music as a distraction from the simple proclamation of the gospel through preaching and through the sacrament. When Thomas Cranmer was consecrated Archbishop of Canterbury on 30 March 1533, he was well equipped to forward reform when given the opportunity. But Henry VIII's objections to liturgical change made progress difficult. Yet in 1537, he ordered Bibles in Latin and English to be placed in every church, while continuing to forbid the use of English during the services. With the king's sanction in 1542, a Committee of Convocation was set up consisting of 2 bishops and 6 other clergy. It was to look at revising the service books, especially the missals, antiphoners, and portafores or breviaries, to eradicate all reference to the Bishop of Rome, to remove all apocryphal and legendary materials, the names and memorials of saints not mentioned in Scripture or in the ancient doctrines of the Church, and all superstitious prayers, collects, versicles, and responses. The breviary had been used mainly by religious orders, by then abolished, and it was felt that a prayer book for more general use was needed. The commission began by simplifying the numerous and complex rubrics. Its work was impeded by the Act of 6 Articles of 1543. That's a mistake. It should be 1539, which made Reformed teaching impossible under pain of severe penalties. Little was achieved during the king's lifetime, although in 1542 the use of the Sarum Breviary was imposed throughout the southern province, so ending much diversity. And in 1543 a chapter of the Bible was commanded to be read in English after the Te Deum at Matins and after the Magnificat at evensong. Pick that up later as we turn to Professor Philip Hughes' Theology of the English Reformers and the chapter on preaching and worship. To this end, the following counsel is given. First, to examine your lives. This is from the homily. In conversations by the rule of God's commandments, and whereinsoever ye perceive yourselves to have offended, either by will, word, or deed, there to bewail your own sinfulness, and to confess yourselves to Almighty God with full purpose of amendment of life. And if ye shall perceive your offenses to be such as are not only against God, but against your neighbors, then ye shall reconcile yourselves unto them, being ready to make restitution and satisfaction according to the uttermost of your powers, for all injuries and wrongs done by you to any other, and being likewise ready to forgive others that have offended you, as you have forgiveness of your offenses at God's hand. For otherwise the receiving of Holy Communion doth nothing else but increase your damnation. The second of these exhortations is addressed to those who show themselves negligent to come to the Lord's table. You know, says the minister, how grievous and unkind a thing it is when a man hath prepared a rich feast, decked his table with all kinds of provision, so that there lacketh nothing but the guests to sit down, and yet they are called, who without any excuse most unthankfully refuse to come, which in any such case would not be moved, who would not think a great injury and wrong done to him. Wherefore, most dearly beloved in Christ, take ye good heed, lest ye, withdrawing yourselves from this holy supper, provoke God's indignation against you. The congregation is reminded that those who, in the parable, for a variety of pretexts, refused to accept the invitation to the banquet were not excused, but were uncounted worthy of the heavenly feast, which is the plainest and most solemn of the warnings. We pick up with the third exhortation on the homily in our next session. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.